this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the collective shadow. Okay, so this video is all about the collective shadow, and so in this video we're going to be looking at how the collective shadow is similar to the individual shadow, and we'll also be looking at societal dynamics through the lens of the collective shadow. Alright, so when it comes to understanding the shadow in a nutshell, the shadow is basically everything that's been repressed and made unconscious. So with the individual shadow, it's everything that we as individuals repress in our own psyche, but when it comes to the collective shadow, it's every collective group of people, from smaller groups of people to even the whole entire human species. It's everything that's been made unconscious in the collective. And so in any given collective of people, all of the individual shadows of the individual people within that group shape the collective shadow, and the collective shadow of the group shapes the shadows of those individuals. And so we shape the collective shadow, and the collective shadow shapes us. So it's always very much reflective of the axiom, as within, so without. And so it is the inner workings of every person's psyche in the conglomerate that actually shapes a lot of our collective dynamics, from the institutions that we have, to the types of interactions that we have, to the general paradigms that we hold as a society. So we could say that in many ways, human society is a macrocosmic expression of the microcosm of the psyche. And so this is the lens that we're going to be using to explore certain societal dynamics. All right, so before we get into describing the collective shadow, I want to talk first about the individual shadow. So as I had said, the shadow in general is whatever we've made unconscious to ourselves. And I talk about the shadow a lot on my channel, and I often refer to the shadow as kind of like a dark closet in the human psyche where we essentially lock away parts of ourselves that we are either unable or unwilling to be conscious of at a given time. And ultimately, it's a really good metaphor is because it frames the shadow as a place where we put these aspects as opposed to the aspects themselves. And so if we want to integrate the shadow, we're not integrating the shadow itself. We're basically taking elements of ourself out of the shadowy closet. And so it's very helpful in relation to shadow work with that metaphor. Now, the dark closet metaphor I find is something that is about 95% true to form. And the 5% that I would say is a little bit divergent from how the shadow actually functions is the idea that we take these aspects and we put them in the shadow, right? So we don't really put these aspects anywhere. What's happening is that we're just creating a blind spot within consciousness to where we can no longer see these elements of ourself. They don't really go anywhere. We don't really put them anywhere. They're just there, and they often exist directly adjacent to parts of ourself that we are conscious of, but we just go unconscious to them. And so to offer a slightly more accurate metaphor, albeit a less user-friendly metaphor, is if you were to imagine that your psyche is represented by a big plot of land. And on this plot of land, it is a bright and sunny day, and so the sun is shining on it, and the sun in this case represents your conscious awareness. But there are areas in that bright and sunny plot of land that are almost like completely blotted out by darkness. So this is where the metaphor gets tricky, because of course on a bright and sunny day, even areas that are kind of in shadow or are shady are going to be something that we can still see, so it's not going to be like the shade underneath a tree is going to be completely and totally blotting out the sun from our vision. But if we can imagine that on this plot of land, some areas are as brightly lit as noon on a bright sunny day, and then other areas are as dark as midnight on the night of the new moon in the middle of the woods. And the reason why I'm using this slightly more accurate but less user-friendly metaphor is that it's really, really helpful for understanding the similarities between the individual shadow and the collective shadow. Ultimately, the collective shadow, when it comes to things that within the collective, within society, that we're conscious of, they often exist directly adjacent to things that are within the collective shadow. So if you recall in the movie The Lion King, where Mufasa is telling Simba that he's going to one day be king over everything that the light touches, but the elephant graveyard, where all the antagonist characters hang out, is always perpetually shrouded in shadow, even on a bright sunny day. That's the nature of the collective shadow. The collective shadow is always something that's obscured to us, even if it's right out there in broad daylight. Now, in relation to this metaphor where we have this plot of land that's brightly lit in the areas that we're conscious of and completely blacked out in areas that we're not conscious of, the areas that are brightly lit would represent the collective ego, whereas the areas that are, let's say, dimly lit or completely blacked out would be the collective shadow. So on an individual level, we each have an individual ego and an individual shadow. And on the collective level, every single collective has a collective ego and a collective shadow. And as I had mentioned, the collective ego and collective shadow often exist in close proximity to one another. They can take up the same space as one another, but we can have a totally different relationship to them based off of whether or not they're in the auspices of the collective ego or in the auspices of the collective shadow. Now, on an individual level, the ego is everything that we identify with, everything that we see as self, everything that we identify as I or me. It's everything that we know and accept about our personality, and it's how we think of who we are. With this perception of the ego being who we are, it also exists in relation to the negative space of who we're not. And when we're building our identity or building our ego, it's very, very common for us to say, I'm like this and I'm not like that. It's identifying with a particular quality and rejecting its opposite to maintain that identity. It often comes up as a polarization where we identify with one thing and we reject its opposite. And so if we consider the ego the positive space of the personality, the shadow is the negative space from which that positive space is defined. And we can often create polarizations within the ego where we identify with one thing and we reject its opposite. And so if the ego is the positive space of the personality, it defines itself in relation to the negative space that is the shadow. For example, let's say that I identify as being a good person. Well, ultimately, my identity as being a good person is going to exist in relation to my conceptualization of what a bad person is, because it's a dichotomy. So I have good being defined in relation to its opposite, which is badness. And so if I see myself through the lens of good and bad, what's going to happen is I'm going to cling very, very tightly to the parts of myself that I identify as good, and I'm going to push away the parts of myself that I see as bad. So this identity of goodness can only exist in relation to my conceptualization of badness. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to maintain consciousness of the parts of myself that are good and probably blot out my awareness of the parts of myself that are bad to maintain that identity of goodness. So the ego is frequently formed with the idea I'm like this, with the echo of I'm not like that. And so the more strongly we identify with qualities that are in our ego and the more tightly we hold on to those qualities, the more we're going to push away their opposites or anything that we see as threatening to those identities. And so the stronger the ego and the stronger the identity, and the more rigid we are about those things, the more that we're going to be pushing those other opposite elements into the shadow. And so if we look from this vantage point, the shadow and the ego are a bit like yin and yang, where the positive space of the personality, which is the ego, is defined in relation to the negative space of the shadow. And this is also true for the collective ego and the collective shadow. So that which is identified with in the collective ego often exists in opposition to and in relation to the collective shadow and that which is collectively repressed. Now, the collective ego is a conglomeration of all of the most normative things within a given culture. Now, when I use the word culture here, I mean culture in a very, very general sense. So oftentimes when we think of culture, we think, oh, a culture within a specific country, or let's say maybe a specific ethnic group has a culture. But I mean culture much more broadly. So I mean culture even in the sense that a workplace has a culture. So a culture could be really microcosmic, like the culture in a given household specifically. It could be a workplace culture, it could be a subculture, it could be the culture within a particular nation, or it could be the culture of the entire human species. And the collective ego is going to be very, very different from culture to culture. So for example, the collective ego in one workplace is not going to be the same as the collective ego of another workplace, or the culture in medieval England is not going to be the same as the culture in 21st century America. So every one of these types of cultures, from the micro to the macro, macro is always going to have a collective ego that represents everything that's the most normative and mainstream within that given culture. And they're also going to have a collective shadow. And so the collective shadow is all the people, places, things, situations, and ideas that are marginalized, that are oppressed, that are papered over, that are ignored, that are seen as unimportant, that are de-emphasized within a given collective. And everything that exists within the scope of the collective ego within a given culture will be emphasized and seen as important, whereas everything that exists within the scope of the collective shadow will be at least ignored and at most annihilated from existence. So there's definitely a spectrum there. So there are definitely things that are more shrouded in the collective shadow than other things that are also in the collective shadow. Now, as I'd mentioned before, the definition of culture is really quite broad. And so I like to liken all cultures to being like cultures in a petri dish. So basically we have a context, which is the petri dish itself, and then we have all of the different microorganisms that are there within a given petri dish. And basically through the interaction of all of these different microorganisms, we have certain emergent qualities that arise from that interaction. And this is the way that I like to think about how culture acts in terms of different interactions with people. You have different people who come together, and then certain emergent qualities arise from that interaction between people. And one of those emergent qualities is the collective ego that forms, and then we also have the collective shadow that's there. So if we can take a zoomed out perspective as though we're looking at a petri dish, it can be really, really helpful for starting to understand the workings of society through the lens of the collective, through the collective shadow. And so if we can look at the collective ego and the collective shadow of a given culture with the same type of detachment and zoomed out perspective that a scientist has when looking at the culture within a petri dish, this can really help us understand quite a lot about the collective shadow of a given culture. Now, prior to being on YouTube, I used to be a high school graphic design teacher. And one of the things that really stuck out to me is that the culture in every single class that I taught was totally different. So I taught 6 classes a day. And basically, it would be that first period had a totally different feeling to it than second period, and third period very different from second period. And so it was almost as though, it was all happening in the same space. It was all happening in my classroom, but it was almost like a totally different space depending on who occupied it. And so even in a very limited context like this, a given culture can start to form, and along with it, a collective ego and a collective shadow. And so we can look at culture in a very microcosmic way like that, or we can look toward the macrocosm, where basically the collective ego and collective shadow is going to be very, very different in the United States compared to Mexico, compared to China, compared to Cuba. And so it could be the case that that which is in the collective ego in France is actually something that's relegated to the collective shadow in Australia. And that which is in the collective ego in Australia could be relegated to the collective shadow in Canada. It really just depends on what's considered normal or normative within a given culture as to what's going to be in the collective ego or in the collective shadow. Now, an interesting dynamic to look at in relation to the collective ego and the collective shadow is the relationship between a culture and a subculture. So a subculture exists within a dominant culture. So one thing exists within the other. And basically, the dominant culture is going to have a certain collective ego and a certain collective shadow, and it's very common that a subculture takes something within the collective shadow of the dominant culture and then makes that part of the collective ego of the subculture. So for example, when I was like a teenager and early 20-something, like I really identified strongly with being in the goth subculture. And so in the goth subculture, there were certain ways of dressing and certain styles of music, or maybe even a certain orientation to life that would be something that would be relegated to the collective shadow of the dominant culture and seen as not normal or not normative. And I personally really enjoyed being part of that subculture. I feel like it really helped me with my individuation because I was able to, in a sense, rebel from, let's say, the collective ego of the dominant culture and start to find my own self separate from the collective ego of the dominant culture. So one definition of individuation is where we have the collective ego of our society or our family or our community of origin, and we start to develop ourselves as an individual, and our own individual ego starts to go separate from the collective ego of whatever collective we belong to. And so belonging within a subculture for me at the time was a great way for me to carve out my own identity and to, kind of do that with a group of other people who are also kind of on the same wavelength, who also enjoyed the same types of things as me. So I wasn't doing it all by myself. Now, a caveat that I would mention here is that if somebody rejects the collective ego of the dominant culture entirely to just go over and adopt the collective ego of the given subculture or another culture, ultimately that doesn't lead forth to individuation, because all you're doing is putting on the collective ego of another collective. Really, it's about being able to have a stepping stone to branch out and to start to explore yourself separate from the collective ego that you were raised in. But for me personally, being able to connect with the collective ego of the goth subculture helped me to question and push back on the collective ego of the dominant culture. And this enabled me to hypercharge my own individuation because I was able to question the bits and pieces of my own ego that were operating off of the defaults that I had been indoctrinated into and influenced into by the myriad of forces that emanate from the collective ego. And because I got pushback from the collective ego for my divergences, it really inoculated me against any type of criticism that maybe comes at me for not being normal or normative. But ultimately, one of the negative side effects of belonging to this subculture is that people who would be very deeply invested in certain elements of the collective ego would see me as threatening to the collective ego, and they would see me as a threat to what they conceptualized of as good and right and proper. So there was a fair amount of negative feedback and pushback that I got from older adults and peers alike. To them at the time, I was a representation of the collective shadow and of their individual shadow, and I was sometimes treated as such, where somebody who had not integrated what I identified with, or somebody who would maybe even project things that they had pushed away, and as a result would treat me quite negatively. And of course, this was really, really frustrating and annoying at the time because I would have these interactions that I really, really didn't want to have, but it was also a masterclass in how people interact with the collective shadow, and it helps me get a small taste of what it's like to belong within the collective shadow, and how those who are shrouded in the collective shadow are often treated. So that which belongs to the collective shadow is often ignored or maligned. Now, if we zoom out and we go to a more macrocosmic perspective where we're looking at different countries, now within every given country, every country has its own collective ego and collective shadow, but within the whole of humanity, certain countries are in the collective ego and other countries are in the collective shadow. So oftentimes the countries that have been labeled as first world nations will be in the collective ego. And that way, if something negative happens within one of the first world nations, it's something that people tend to register as, let's say, more of a tragedy when it happens. So for example, I live in America, but if something, let's say, sad or tragic happens in France, it's I know that a lot of Americans feel it, and I feel it. It seems like it's happening almost on the same plane of existence. But I've also noticed that in general, when something happens in a country that's not part of the collective ego, it tends to be regarded as almost something that's happening on some other plane of existence, some abstract place. And when we look at this through the lens of collective ego versus collective shadow, we can start to see how big our blind spots can become in relation to what we're able to see as connected to us and what we see as disconnected from us. And this same type of dynamic with ignoring and maligning can happen in the microcosm too. Like within a given city, we can have elements of the city that are there within the collective ego that people are generally conscious of, that people are, let's say, deem as important. And then there can be parts of that city that are totally shrouded in the collective shadow. Or even with family members, it could be a family, let's say that certain people in the family are more, let's say, accepted within the collective ego of the family, and then somebody who doesn't belong within the collective ego of the family family gets kind of scapegoated and pushed away. So within every collective of human beings, no matter how large or how small, there will always be a collective ego. So with the ubiquity of the shadow in mind, let's talk about what the function of the shadow is. Now, it's really common for us to kind of see the shadow as an antagonistic force. Ultimately, if our goal is to become more conscious and to integrate our aspects that are in the shadow, we might just view kind of the shadow as something that stands in the way of that. But ultimately, the shadow has a really, really important function. The shadow is kind of almost like an organ within the human psyche that enables us to become unconscious to what's going to threaten our sense of stability. So the function of the individual shadow is to maintain a sense of homeostasis and stability within the psyche by pushing away elements of ourself and repressing elements that we are not yet ready to integrate. And then there's the process of shadow work that we can use to basically work with our traumas and to let go of limiting beliefs and to shift our paradigm and to basically do all the inner work that's necessary to prepare ourselves for that integration to happen so that we can expand our consciousness, so that we can integrate those elements of ourself. So the function of the individual shadow is to maintain that sense of homeostasis and stability, and a lot of work has to be done in order to integrate those elements of ourself without creating instability within the psyche. And so the collective shadow actually has the same exact function as the individual shadow. So in the same way that the individual shadow is there to maintain homeostasis and stability within the psyche, the collective shadow is there to maintain a sense of homeostasis and stability within society and within the human species at large. So the human species as a collective culture, as well as individual societies within the human species, will have to repress certain elements of, let's say, what's possible or what's potential there until the society develops enough to integrate in whatever happens to be in the collective shadow. And so the collective shadow actually has the same exact function as the individual shadow, which is to maintain homeostasis and stability within society. So ultimately, a given society or even humanity as a whole collective has to develop certain technologies, has to, let's say, have certain paradigm shifts, has to, let's say, work through certain collective traumas, generational traumas passed down through families and through societies. A lot of things have to happen to make room for the collective shadow to be integrated. And sometimes if we try to integrate the collective shadow too quickly, what happens is that it creates a sense of instability in the society at large. So the collective shadow is there so that things don't progress or don't change too quickly and therefore don't create a sense of instability. And depending on how a society is structured and the political schools of thought that are at play, or the level of collective trauma that there is, or, there's tons and tons of other factors, is going to determine what can be and what can't be integrated. And so if, let's say, for example, let's go back in time and we'll go to a nomadic kind of group of people. So this is ultimately before we've kind of settled down into civilization. So once we start to settle down into civilization, we have then surpluses of food and people can start to specialize. And now you can get, instead of everybody just hunting and gathering all the time, you can get doctors and lawyers and teachers and all sorts of other types of professions that are possible with specialization. So in let's say, a civilized society that actually has set down roots, you're going to be able to do that. Now, this wasn't possible until I think maybe civilization arose maybe 10,000 years ago or so, or maybe in and around that time. Before that, we were nomads for a long time. And so everything was really hand to mouth, and everybody had to hunt, and everybody had to gather. Now, let's say that there was somebody within that collective that happened to just have natural skills as a lawyer. Well, ultimately, they exist in a society where the lawyer is not able to be integrated as an archetype yet within that collective. And so if that person decides, okay, you guys go hunt and gather, I'm just going to spend my time being a lawyer and if you ever need any kind of legal representation, let me know. Well, ultimately, that person isn't in tandem with the level of development that society is at that would be necessary for something like a lawyer to be relevant. And so the archetype of the lawyer has to be pushed to the collective shadow in that particular group of people, in that particular culture, because there's just no space for that yet. And if that collective were to decide to let that person just become a lawyer, what would happen is that that collective stability would be at least threatened and maybe totally compromised. So if that person just became a lawyer, then ultimately, oh, you have one less person hunting and gathering, and maybe they're not able to make it, and maybe that society becomes really unstable and just shakes apart. Whereas if you look at an ancient civilization, like let's say Mesopotamia or ancient Greece or ancient Egypt, basically in these societies, they were complex enough and structured enough to handle the integration of something like a lawyer or a doctor or a teacher. So basically, like once your society gets more complex and is able to handle enough and is able to integrate more, basically more things get to come out of the collective shadow. So new potentials get to arise, and also it's like new things get to be integrated just in general. And so depending on how developed a given society is, if it's less developed, a lot of human potential is just going to be left in the shadow. And currently in our modern society, even though we're more developed than in nomadic times, there's a lot of things that are pushed to the collective shadow because we haven't gotten to the points of development that we would need to integrate those things. And so a lot of human potential still gets left off the table, and a lot of people, places, things, and ideas remain cast into the shadow because we're just not at a point of development yet to integrate those things in. Or there are forces that are specifically keeping those at bay, even if they are ready to be integrated into the collective. And ultimately, human beings have so much potential in ourselves, but we have to actually have it linked up to a society that can sustain that potential. So for example, if I were born 50 years prior to what I was, I probably wouldn't be able to share this video with you, and therefore would probably always just keep my insights to myself because I wouldn't have a platform through which to share what I'm sharing. And so basically, even having something like YouTube and the internet and things like that give me the capacity to plug something of an innate quality or skill that I have, and to allow this human potential to come out of the shadow and out into the collective ego. Or if we take something like, let's say that there's like somebody who has like amazing talent to be a computer programmer, but they happen to be born in, let's say, the Renaissance era. Well, ultimately, those are skills that they're not going to be able to like realize or utilize, and how are they even going to become conscious of that without something to plug that into? And so in the same way that we use shadow work on the individual level to work through whatever barriers that we have to integrating certain aspects of ourselves, when we individuate ourselves, when we start to develop our consciousness and to expand ourselves, ultimately this enables us to get in touch with more and more of our individual human potential. But when it comes to the collective, it's like there is this collective movement toward an expansion in consciousness. And so with that, the more we expand our consciousness, the more conflicts come up, the more ideologies arise and then fall away, and the more technologies come up that we can utilize. And let's say certain technologies might free up some people from having to do, let's say, really cumbersome work, and then they can focus on things that are more like within their zone of genius and more, so basically as a collective, there's this whole process going on that has been going on since the dawn of humanity of our collective development, which enables more and more and more of what's in the collective shadow to be realized. And so it really behooves us as individuals to serve the expansion in collective consciousness as much as possible. But the collective ego of humanity is always expanding and always growing, but this growth process isn't so linear. It's oftentimes 2 steps forward and 1 step back, which means that maybe in a given society we have, let's say, certain developments that happen, and then we lose some some of our wisdom, and then, then we gain other types of wisdom, and then later on that wisdom that was lost gets reintegrated back into it, and so on and so on. So ultimately, the collective shadow has a very important function. It keeps everything working and keeps everything stable, and it basically helps us maintain our civilization. But at the same time, we want to, as much as possible, be integrating and opening up to new possibilities. Now, in order to maintain the balance of homeostasis and growth, there are two forces within the individual human psyche that are at work, and two forces that are also going on in the collective dynamic, which I call the integrating force and the disintegrating force. So basically, with the integrating force is everything that moves us more toward the expansion of the ego on a collective and individual level, and in the integration of the shadow. So it's basically about, let's say, continuing to shine the light and continuing to expand the scope of consciousness to integrate all that is. And this is always trying to expand. Now, we also have the disintegrating force, and the disintegrating force acts as a counter force to the integrating force. And the disintegrating force basically is there to keep what's in the shadow. So it's basically something that's like there, and its purpose is specifically to keep us unconscious of what we're unconscious to. And so basically these two forces are always at war with one another, but they work within the ecosystem of the psyche and in society at large to keep things in a state of homeostasis. So with this dynamic, ultimately the disintegrating force slowly cedes to the integrating force over time, creating a gradual expansion in consciousness. Now, this dynamic isn't always so slow and gradual. Sometimes it's the case that, let's say, the disintegrating force actually cedes very quickly to the integrating force. And these are times of, let's say, chaos, instability, but lots and lots of growth and expansion. And it tends to make us have to rise to the occasion to make sure that society can handle these growing pains. And then there's also the case that the disintegrating force can really dig itself in and to kind of just stay stuck. And what ends up happening is that the integrating force continues to push against it and continues to push against it. And almost like two tectonic plates pressing up against one another. Eventually, there's an earthquake, or eventually there's some kind of natural disaster that happens. So if the disintegrating force refuses to cede to the integrating force, what happens is oftentimes there are things like conflicts and wars and all sorts of other things. And so in the ideal situation, which reality is never ideal, you have this slow, gradual ceding of the disintegrating force to the integrating force. But very often, our biggest developments come from these situations where the integrating and disintegrating force have some unpredictable things go on, where either the integrating force charges forward very, very quickly and the disintegrating force, let's say, loses its opposition, or in the case where there's really this gridlock and almost like this intense pressure between these two forces. There's even a situation that can happen where the disintegrating force starts to come in the opposite direction and we experience a backlash. And the way that I could describe this is almost like that which you resist persists. So basically, if there's a resistance toward the integrating force, what oftentimes happens is that the pressure of the backward force actually shoots the integrating force forward. So these are the dynamics that can come about within human societies and within the individual psyche when it comes to these two forces. Ultimately with the disintegrating force trying to keep us unaware of what we're unaware of, and the integrating force trying to gradually expand our sense of awareness. Oh, and one thing that I had forgotten to mention within the integrating force and disintegrating force, oftentimes these two things can become kind of like a nutcracker in a way. So let's say where the disintegrating force becomes an immovable object and the integrating force becomes an unstoppable force. In this type of situation, oftentimes creates a lot of growth for a society because it's almost like things crack open in this space. So let's say that society itself is like, let's say, a walnut, and then basically you have the integrating and disintegrating force like pressing very, very much against this walnut. Now all of a sudden it gets cracked open and these new potentials arise. And so oftentimes where there's political or ideological conflict, we can get these types of growth happening. And oftentimes, if the disintegrating force is just steadily like ceding to the integrating force, we don't get the conflict that's necessary for us to open up these new potentials. So oftentimes, a lot of the social and let's say political conflicts that come up are there specifically to serve the forces of integration and expansion. And in these schisms and in these earthquakes, it's often those things that shake people awake. It helps people become more conscious of what's going on in society, helps people get more engaged in, let's say, social and political issues that might be arising. So if we think about these two forces as almost like two forces within an ecosystem, we recognize that they're both indispensable to the progress of forward movement. So the disintegrating force is not an enemy to the integrating force. Oftentimes the disintegrating force, not only is it there to maintain the stability of things, but it also digs itself in specifically so that the integrating force has something to push up against. And there's so much wisdom within the system of our own psyche when it comes to the interplay with the dynamics between the integrating and disintegrating force. Oftentimes it's something that we consciously don't understand. There's so much wisdom there. And the same thing is true with the external system of every given collective, including humanity at large. So oftentimes we can look at things going on in terms of how humanity is interacting with one another, and we can think, oh my gosh, like everything is going really, really terribly. But oftentimes the things that go negatively are very much the things that wake us up. Now, at the end of every video, I always try to give some kind of practical application for the information. Now, this video is far more just about understanding societal dynamics through the lens of the collective and individual shadow. Ultimately, ideally you action upon it by trying to serve the expansion and progression of that consciousness. But ultimately, you would probably be doing that anyway, even without your intending to do so. What I would recommend from here is to take what I've said in this video and to look at yourself as a microcosm and to look at society as a macrocosm and to see what ways that, let's say, the integrating force is coming into play within you as well as the disintegrating force, and to also notice the same in society. Notice which things are actually leading to more of an expansion in consciousness and which things seem to be in opposition to that expansion of consciousness. But then start to see how those things also help, let's say, wake things up, help expand the consciousness more generally. Ultimately, my recommendation here is to almost view human society and human culture as a species and in your individual community as a scientist would look at bacteria in a petri dish, and to see all of the emergent qualities, to see what's happening within the collective ego, see what's happening within the collective shadow, and to see how you're playing a role in that and how you are also shaped by the forces of the collective ego and collective shadow. So my recommendation is simply to try on this perspective and to just kind of start to contemplate into the different implications of these perspectives. And I hope that it's very illuminating. Anyway, that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, click the like button below and subscribe and leave me a comment down below. Also, if you would like to learn more about the shadow, go ahead and check out my shadow integration masterclass called the 6 Simple Steps to Shadow Integration. You can do that by going to shadowintegration.org/masterclass. And that's all I have for you for now, and until next time, keep becoming more you.